The weight of reliability. The M14 rifle felt heavier than usual in Murphy's hands as he shifted position behind the ammunition crates, watching the grey dawn break over the Vosges mountains. The wooden stock, slick with November rain, reminded him of his grandfather's hunting rifle back in Texas, solid, dependable, built for a different kind of fighting. Around the supply depot outside Holtzwihr, his squad had spent the night preparing for what intelligence called an imminent counterattack, though Murphy suspected the Germans were already closer than anyone upstairs wanted to admit. Private Jensen crouched nearby, nervous fingers tracing the edges of a captured German machine pistol. The kid had been asking the same question for 3 days. Why stick with the heavy American semi-automatic when the enemy's weapons fired faster? Murphy understood the appeal. When you're 19 and scared, rapid fire feels like insurance against the dark. But he'd seen too many men empty magazines into trees and shadows, leaving themselves defenseless when it mattered. Lieutenant Hendricks emerged from the command post, a converted barn that still smelled of hay and diesel fuel. His face carried the particular exhaustion of junior officers in the Vosges, responsible for impossible positions with insufficient men, trying to hold ground that doctrine said required twice their strength. The 3rd Infantry Division had been grinding through these mountains for weeks, each advance measured in yards rather than miles, each supply route a lifeline stretched thin across hostile terrain. "Murphy," Hendricks called quietly, "take the left flank. Intelligence says they're probing our weak spots, looking for the seams." He gestured toward the pine-covered hills that loomed above their shallow valley. "Radio's been crackling all morning. Looks like Ivan's veterans from the Eastern Front, desperate to cut our supply lines before winter locks everything down." Murphy nodded, checking his ammunition count one final time. 60 rounds in stripper clips, each one accounted for and carefully maintained despite the wet conditions. The M14's reliability had become legendary among the men who'd carried it through Italy and France. Not flashy, not fast, but it worked when everything else failed. In a war increasingly dominated by automatic weapons and overwhelming firepower, that consistency felt almost old-fashioned. The first mortar shells began falling as Murphy reached his position, sending fountains of mud and pine needles into the air. Through the smoke and confusion, he caught glimpses of movement in the tree line, coordinated, professional, using terrain with the expertise that came from surviving the Russian front. These weren't the green replacements they'd been facing for weeks. These were soldiers who understood winter warfare and desperate fighting. Jensen scrambled into the foxhole beside him, clutching the German weapon with white knuckles. "Sarge, they're coming in force. Maybe company strength, maybe more." His voice cracked slightly on the last words, betraying the fear that every man felt, but few admitted. Murphy adjusted his field of fire, noting the drainage ditch that ran parallel to their position. Perfect cover for a flanking movement if the Germans were smart enough to spot it. "Remember what we talked about," Murphy said quietly, settling the M14 stock against his shoulder. "Slow and steady. Pick your shots. Let the weapon do what it was designed to do." Around them, the sound of incoming artillery grew closer, each burst shaking loose dirt from the hastily constructed earthworks that represented their only protection against what was coming. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The German advance began with textbook precision, grey figures moving through the Vosges tree line in short rushes, while machine guns provided covering fire from concealed positions. Murphy watched through the M14's iron sights, counting muzzle flashes and noting how the enemy used every fold in the terrain to mask their approach. These weren't the confused, desperate attacks they'd repelled earlier in the campaign. This felt coordinated, professional, the kind of assault that broke defensive lines and kept going. Lieutenant Hendricks had positioned their thin perimeter based on what the map showed, not what the ground actually offered. The left flank, where Murphy now crouched, should have been held by a full squad. Instead, he had Jensen and two other riflemen spread across a frontage that doctrine said required 3 times their number. The ammunition depot behind them contained supplies for 3 different Allied advances. Lose it, and the entire 3rd Infantry Division's momentum would stall in these frozen mountains. Radio chatter from the command post confirmed what Murphy could already see. The other defensive positions were taking heavy pressure. Sergeant Williams, holding the right side of the perimeter, reported at least 2 enemy squads massing for an assault. The center position had already taken casualties from mortar fire, and their machine gun was acting up in the wet conditions. Help wasn't coming. Everyone else was fighting their own desperate holding actions across the Vosges front. Jensen fumbled with his captured German weapon, trying to figure out how to change magazines under pressure. "This thing jams every 3rd burst," he muttered, wiping rain from his eyes. "How do they fight with equipment like this?" Murphy said nothing, focused on the approaching enemy. Experience had taught him that weapons worked for the soldiers who understood them. The Germans knew their equipment's quirks and limitations. Jensen was trying to use a foreign tool without comprehending its design. At 200 yards, Murphy's M14 found its first target, a German squad leader gesturing to his men from behind a fallen log. The semi-automatic rifle's report echoed across the valley, sharp and decisive. The enemy soldier dropped, and his squad immediately sought better cover, their advance rhythm broken. Murphy worked the weapon with practiced efficiency, each shot carefully aimed at priority targets. Machine gun crews, officers, anyone trying to coordinate the assault. The rifle's weight, which had seemed like a disadvantage during long marches through the Vosges, now became an asset. The M14 remained stable during rapid fire, allowing Murphy to engage multiple targets without losing accuracy. While Jensen struggled with a jammed weapon and fouled ammunition, the American semi-automatic functioned flawlessly, despite the rain and mud that plagued other equipment throughout the valley. When the second wave of mortar rounds landed closer to their position, Murphy realized the Germans had spotted their muzzle flashes and were adjusting fire accordingly. The enemy understood exactly what they were facing: a thin line of defenders that could be broken with sufficient pressure applied at the right point. Through his rifle sights, Murphy watched German engineers moving equipment forward, preparing to exploit whatever breakthrough their assault troops created. The tactical situation was deteriorating faster than their training had prepared them for, but the M14 continued to perform exactly as its designers intended. Each round found its mark, disrupting enemy movements and forcing the Germans to reconsider their approach. Murphy began to understand that his section of the perimeter might hold, not because of superior numbers or better positions, but because one reliable weapon in steady hands could change the mathematics of a small unit engagement in ways that no manual adequately described. By mid-morning, the pattern of the German assault became clear to Murphy as he shifted position along his section of the defensive line. The enemy was probing systematically, testing each part of the American perimeter while massing strength for a decisive breakthrough. Radio reports from adjacent units painted a grim picture across the entire Vosges sector. The 3rd Infantry Division was stretched thin, holding too much ground with too few men, gambling that supply lines could be maintained until reinforcements arrived. Jensen had given up on the captured German weapon after it jammed for the 4th time, reverting to his standard-issue carbine despite its shorter range. The kid was learning what combat veterans knew instinctively. Reliability mattered more than firepower when everything depended on weapons functioning under impossible conditions. Around them, other squad members dealt with similar equipment failures. Magazines that wouldn't seat properly in the mud, ammunition that misfired in the wet climate, optical sights fogged beyond usefulness. Lieutenant Hendricks appeared in their foxhole, crawling forward with updated orders that had already been overtaken by events. "Battalion says hold until relieved," he reported, though his expression suggested little confidence in that possibility. Intelligence estimates enemy strength at company level may be reinforced. They're hitting supply lines all along the Vosges front, trying to break our advance before winter sets in completely. Murphy nodded, checking his ammunition supply again. Half his stripper clips were gone, used methodically to disrupt German movements whenever they massed for an assault. The M14 had performed exactly as advertised, each shot accurate, each mechanical function smooth despite conditions that had disabled other weapons throughout their position. But ammunition was finite, and the enemy showed no signs of reducing pressure on their thin defensive line. The critical moment arrived when German engineers began moving through the drainage ditch that paralleled the depot, carrying explosive charges designed to breach the American defenses from an unexpected angle. Murphy spotted them first, recognizing the coordinated movement that distinguished combat engineers from ordinary infantry. They were professionals, probably veterans of urban fighting on the Eastern Front, using terrain features with the expertise that came from desperate experience. "They're flanking us through the ditch," Murphy reported to Hendricks, gesturing toward the German movement. The lieutenant studied the situation through binoculars, calculating distances and angles with the grim precision of officers who'd learned to expect the worst. The engineers were already too close to engage effectively from their current positions. Someone would have to leave the prepared defenses and intercept them in the open ground near the depot. Jensen looked sick as he realized what that meant. "Sarge, that's suicide. They've got machine guns covering that approach, plus whatever else is moving up behind them." His voice carried the fear that every rational person felt when confronted with impossible tactical situations. Murphy understood the mathematics as clearly as anyone. The mission was tactically unsound, probably fatal, definitely beyond what doctrine recommended for a small unit defense. But the alternative was watching German engineers breach their perimeter and destroy the supply depot that kept 3 Allied advances moving through the Vosges mountains. Murphy had carried dead friends' dog tags too many times to accept failure when success remained theoretically possible. The M14's reliability had gotten them this far. Now everything would depend on whether one weapon could perform the impossible against professional soldiers who'd survived the Russian front. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Murphy left a prepared position without a word, knowing that explanations would only give others time to argue with what had to be done. The M14 felt perfectly balanced in his hands as he moved through the muddy ground between the depot and the drainage ditch, using every fold in the terrain to mask his approach from German machine gun positions. Behind him, Jensen and the other squad members provided covering fire, their weapons crackling sporadically in the November rain that turned the entire Vosges battlefield into a slippery maze of mud and broken equipment. The German engineers had advanced farther than expected, their explosive charges already positioned near the depot's weakest point. Murphy could see them working with the methodical efficiency of professionals, laying det cord and preparing fuses while their supporting infantry maintained overwatch from concealed positions. These weren't desperate amateurs. They were combat veterans who'd learned their trade in the brutal siege warfare that characterized the Eastern Front, now applying that expertise to breaking American supply lines. At 50 yards, Murphy's M14 began engaging the engineer team with systematic precision. The semi-automatic rifle's range advantage became decisive in the open ground near the depot, allowing him to strike targets that couldn't effectively return fire with their shorter weapons. Each shot was carefully aimed and immediately effective, disrupting the German timeline and forcing their supporting troops to react to an unexpected threat from an impossible direction. Working from position to position, Murphy used the weapon's reliability to maintain continuous pressure on the engineer team while avoiding the machine gun fire that swept the area in response to his muzzle flashes. The M14's weight provided stability during rapid movement, keeping his shots accurate even when firing from improvised positions behind ammunition crates and disabled vehicles scattered throughout the depot area. When his primary ammunition ran low, Murphy retrieved clips from fallen German soldiers, the rifle's robust design allowing him to use captured rounds without modification. This was the kind of battlefield improvisation that no manual covered. One man with a dependable weapon, fighting position to position against professional soldiers in conditions that made equipment reliability more important than tactical doctrine or superior numbers. The turning point came when German reinforcements attempted to flank Murphy's improvised position, moving through the same drainage ditch their engineers had used. The M14's semi-automatic capability allowed him to engage multiple targets rapidly while continuing to move, something the standard bolt-action rifles could never accomplish. Each German soldier who entered the ditch faced accurate fire from a weapon that functioned perfectly despite mud, rain, and the kind of sustained use that destroyed lesser equipment. Lieutenant Hendricks later described watching from the main defensive position as Murphy held an entire section of the perimeter alone, using the depot's terrain features and the M14's reliability to create what appeared to be multiple defensive positions. The German assault stalled as their supporting elements were systematically eliminated by precise fire from a weapon that refused to malfunction despite impossible conditions. By the time reinforcements arrived from the reserve company, the German engineer team had been eliminated, and their explosive charges safely removed from the depot. The enemy assault troops, deprived of their breakthrough capability and having suffered heavy casualties, withdrew under cover of smoke that drifted across the frozen Vosges landscape like a grey curtain drawn over the morning's violence. Murphy sat against an ammunition crate, methodically cleaning the M14 with the care that combat veterans reserved for equipment that had kept them alive. The rifle showed new scars from the engagement, but every mechanical function remained smooth and reliable. Around him, the depot continued its mission of supplying 3 Allied advances, the supply chain unbroken despite the morning's desperate fighting. What the after-action report would never capture was the moment when Murphy realized he might not make it back to the main defensive line. Crouched in the drainage ditch, with ammunition running low and German voices calling to each other from multiple directions, he'd felt the cold mathematics of combat close around him, like the November rain that soaked through every piece of equipment in the Vosges mountains. The M14 had performed flawlessly, but even perfect weapons couldn't overcome impossible odds indefinitely. The secret that haunted him afterward wasn't the tactical details that Lieutenant Hendricks carefully documented for higher command. It was the 3 seconds when he'd stopped firing and simply listened to the sounds of the battle, German machine guns chattering from the tree line, American rifles answering sporadically from the depot's perimeter, and underneath it all, the quiet breathing of wounded men lying in the mud between the opposing forces. In that moment, Murphy had understood exactly what his grandfather meant about hunting. Sometimes you kept going, not because you were brave, but because stopping felt like betraying everything that mattered. Jensen found him later, sitting beside the cleaned M14, with his hands shaking slightly as he loaded fresh clips. The kid had watched the entire action from the main defensive position, trying to provide covering fire while Murphy moved through the depot area like a man possessed. "Sarge," Jensen said quietly, "how do you do that? How do you keep moving forward when everything's telling you to run?" Murphy looked at the rifle's walnut stock, noting the new scratches that joined older scars from actions across Italy and France. "It's not courage," he said finally. "It's just, when you've got a tool that works, and people depending on you, sometimes there's only one choice that lets you sleep afterward." He didn't mention the dreams that had started after his first Medal of Honor action, or the way certain sounds could make him freeze in the middle of ordinary conversations years later. The real weight wasn't what he'd done, it was what everyone expected him to keep doing, Officers looked at him differently now, calculating how his presence might change impossible situations. Fellow soldiers alternated between admiration and resentment, knowing that his actions raised the standard for what constituted acceptable risk. The 3rd Infantry Division was already talking about another citation, more paperwork that would transform muddy desperation into clean sentences about heroism and tactical innovation. Lieutenant Hendricks approached with preliminary casualty reports and questions from battalion about equipment performance under combat conditions. The M14's reliability had exceeded every specification, functioning perfectly in conditions that disabled other weapons throughout their sector. But Murphy knew the real test wasn't mechanical. It was whether a man could carry the weight of using that reliability to survive situations that killed other soldiers. That evening, as the squad prepared defensive positions for another possible attack, Murphy found himself thinking about the German engineers he'd killed in the drainage ditch. They'd been professionals doing their job, probably fathers and sons fighting for home just as desperately as any American soldier. The M14 had made their deaths clinical and efficient, but it couldn't make them feel less like murders committed by a young man who'd learned to be very good at killing people. The citation would mention tactical innovation and exceptional courage under fire. It wouldn't describe the moment when Murphy had looked at the rifle's iron sights and seen his own reflection. A 21-year-old Texas farm boy who'd become something his family wouldn't recognize, carrying skills that had no peacetime application and memories that would never fade from his sleep. Jensen cleaned his own weapon nearby, working with the methodical care that combat taught every survivor. "Sarge," he said without looking up, "when we get home, how do we explain what happened over here?" Murphy had no answer. Some experiences translated into words, others became silence that you carried alone, hoping that the people who loved you would understand what you couldn't say. 3 hours after the action ended, a correspondent arrived from Stars and Stripes, notebook ready to transform the morning's fighting into the kind of story that sold war bonds and maintained morale back home. Lieutenant Hendricks provided the official version. Technical Sergeant Murphy had displayed exceptional initiative in neutralizing an enemy flanking movement, using superior marksmanship and tactical awareness to preserve a vital supply depot. The M14 rifle had performed admirably under adverse conditions, confirming the weapon's reliability for infantry operations throughout the European theater. What the newspaper wouldn't print was Jensen's quiet observation to another squad member that Murphy had looked sick afterward, sitting beside the cleaned rifle with an expression of someone carrying weight that couldn't be shared. The kid was beginning to understand the difference between battlefield legends and the men who created them. How the same actions that made someone a hero also changed them in ways that medals couldn't address or recognition couldn't heal. The depot resumed normal operations by afternoon, supply trucks rolling through the Vosges Mountains toward forward positions where other young soldiers waited in frozen foxholes for ammunition, food, and the equipment that kept Allied advances moving toward Germany. Murphy's action had preserved one link in that chain, ensuring that the 3rd Infantry Division's momentum wouldn't stall, because German engineers had successfully destroyed a single supply point in the vast logistical network that sustained modern warfare. But preservation came with personal cost that no after-action report could quantify. Murphy found himself checking and rechecking the M14's condition, running his thumb along the walnut stock where new scratches joined older battle damage. The weapon had saved his life and the lives of his squad members, but it had also made him more effective at killing other human beings, a capability that felt increasingly heavy as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion. Years later, when Murphy tried to write about his war experiences, he would struggle to explain the relationship between a soldier and his weapon. The M14 had been more than equipment. It was the tool that allowed him to function when everything else failed, the mechanical reliability that compensated for human fear and uncertainty. But that same reliability had made him responsible for decisions and actions that would echo in his sleep long after the shooting stopped. Jensen kept the German machine pistol as a souvenir, though he never fired it again after the engagement at Holzwihr. Sometimes, cleaning his gear in the evening, he would look across at Murphy methodically maintaining the M14 and wonder what it cost to be that steady under pressure. The kid was learning that heroism looked different from inside, less dramatic, more exhausting, carrying consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The final irony was that Murphy's most reliable weapon became the source of his most persistent memories. Long after the war ended, the smell of gun oil and the weight of wooden stocks would transport him back to November morning in the Vosges Mountains, crouched in a drainage ditch with German voices calling from multiple directions and the cold mathematics of survival, reducing everything to sight pictures and trigger control. The M14 had worked perfectly when it mattered most, but perfection in killing left marks that no amount of cleaning could remove. On quiet evenings, decades later, Murphy would sometimes hold that old rifle and remember Jensen's question about courage. The answer had never been about fearlessness or tactical brilliance. It was about carrying tools that worked when everything else failed, and living with the weight of using them well when other people's lives hung in the balance. The legend was lighter than the memory, but both were carried by the same hands that had learned to be steady when steadiness mattered most. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.